This video was brought to you by Ground News. Since World War II, the US dollar has been the world's reserve currency. This basically means that it's the go-to currency for at least a plurality of international transactions, and financial institutions hold lots of dollars in reserve. As we've seen in Ukraine, this gives the US immense geopolitical leverage, which is why Russian President Vladimir Putin has been trying to move not just Russia, but the rest of the world away from the dollar. This has been a personal bugbear for Putin for a while now, but he's taken things up a notch since Ukraine, and his latest idea is some sort of common currency between the BRICS states. So in this video, we thought we'd take a look at this new BRICS currency, whether it might actually happen, and whether it could even replace the dollar. Hint, the answer's no. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. Putin and Russia's political class more generally have always hated the fact that the US dollar is the world's reserve currency. It gives the US enormous fiscal space, which is one of the reasons the US can afford to send so much aid to Ukraine, and allows the US to unilaterally impose punishing financial sanctions on basically any country, including Russia. Putin probably also remembers the humiliating dollarization of the Russian economy after the 1998 financial crisis, when the Russian state defaulted on its foreign debts, crippling the ruble and forcing ordinary Russians to use the dollar instead. By 2000, US dollars made up 87% of the value of all currency in circulation in Russia, and international investors in Russia were even required to pay their taxes in dollars. Astonishingly, this meant that Russia was the largest dollar-based economy in the world outside of the United States. Not only was this deeply humiliating for a country that had less than a decade ago considered itself a systemic rival to the US, but it also temporarily stripped Russia of its monetary sovereignty. While the Russian economy and the ruble recovered relatively quickly in the years after the crash, thanks to a rise in global oil prices, this was the context in which Putin came to power in 1999, and it's probably one of the reasons he's been trying to reduce Russia's reliance on the dollar ever since. For years, Putin has been trying to reduce the dollar share of Russia's foreign exchange reserves and convince the rest of the world to stop denominating their international trade, especially their oil sales, in dollars. But he hasn't been particularly successful here. Before the war, about half of Russia's reserves were still susceptible to Western sanctions, and a majority of Russia's exports were still denominated in dollars. While that fraction was falling, that's mainly because Russia was denominating more of its sales in euros, which presumably was not what Putin was envisaging when he talked about de-dollarization. Unsurprisingly, Putin and Russia's political class have been increasingly fixated on de-dollarization since the US imposed unprecedented financial sanctions on Russia in response to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, including the seizure of $300 billion worth of central bank reserves and the expulsion of a series of Russian banks from the US-led interbank messaging system SWIFT. Putin has apparently accepted that the ruble isn't going to replace the dollar anytime soon, and his latest idea is a new BRICS currency. For those of you who don't know, BRICS is an acronym first coined by Goldman Sachs in 2001 for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. The BRICS are widely considered the sort of geopolitical counterpoint to the Western G7 bloc, and they've held annual meetings every year for the past decade or so. Anyway, Putin first mentioned the idea of a BRICS currency in June of last year, when, during an address to the BRICS Business Forum, he announced that the bloc was working towards a new global reserve currency. In October, it was mentioned again by a senior Russian diplomat at Moscow's Valdai Club. In January, at a press conference in Angola, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said the idea would be discussed at the next BRICS meeting. And in April, at a press conference in New Delhi, the deputy chairman of Russia's State Duma claimed that the project was well underway. So, before we get into its viability, what would this BRICS currency actually look like? Well, it would almost certainly be a common currency, i.e. a new currency used alongside existing ones, instead of a single currency, i.e. a currency that replaces existing ones like the euro. Apart from that, we don't really know anything. Some reports suggest it could be an equivalent to the IMF's SDR, which is a reserve asset that the IMF issues to distressed economies that can then be traded in for dollars, euros, pound, yen, or even yuan. Other reports suggest that the new currency would instead be tied to the value not of the BRICS currencies, but some basket of commodities, like maybe gold or oil. Possible names include the BRIC coin, or the R5, a reference to the fact that the first letters of the BRICS currencies all begin with the letter R. So, could it actually happen? Well, there's definitely an appetite for it, at least in some BRICS countries, and America's newfound fondness for financial sanctions and the impact on Federal Reserve rate hikes on developing economies have only encouraged advocates of de-dollarization. Brazil's Lula has been railing against the dollar for years, and China has been trying to internationalize the yuan for a while now. Unfortunately for Putin, Lula and Xi, there is absolutely no chance of this BRICS currency happening, let alone of it replacing the dollar. This might sound unduly partisan coming from a neutral channel, but, well, this idea just doesn't add up on so many levels. For starters, the idea of China and India, two strategic rivals, might voluntarily join a currency union is a complete non-starter. Second, none of the other BRICS countries would actually want to start a currency union with South Africa, which looks more and more like an economic basket case. Third, countries like Russia and China would have to liberalise capital flows for this to work, which looks very unlikely. Fourth, trade between the BRICS members is severely imbalanced, and they're completely different economies. For example, India and South Africa both running persistent and large deficits with the other members, which means they buy more than they sell with the other members, and India is an infinitely more open economy than, say, Russia. We're not going to explain in detail why this is a problem because it involves some pretty complicated economics, but the TLDR is that common currencies only really work when countries have at least relatively similar economies, and even small trade imbalances can become problematic. Just look at what's happened to the so-called deficit countries in the Eurozone. This is one of the reasons why Lula's more modest plan to form a common currency with Argentina still hasn't happened. Ultimately, Putin's BRICS currency looks very unlikely to ever materialise, let alone replace the dollar. But no matter whose side you're on, dollar or competitor, everyone and every news source has a bias. And no matter how hard any of us try, we will inevitably miss a story, or worse, only get half the story. Blind spots are everywhere. Thankfully, Ground News makes discovering your blind spots easier than ever. Ground News is a website and app that collects thousands of articles to help you better understand the world around you. For every story, you can see which news outlets have reported on the story and where these outlets fall on the political spectrum. You can even compare headlines as well as read the full story without ever leaving the app. But my favourite part of the app and website is the aptly named Blind Spot feed. Here you can see specific stories that have received excessively lopsided coverage. For example, check out this story about Putin calling for stronger border security. It only has a 13% left-leaning coverage, meaning that if you only read left-leaning news outlets, there's a good chance you missed the story. And if you click on the story, you can dig even deeper. Ground News offers a comprehensive breakdown for every story. You can read every headline, view the political bias and factuality score for every source, and you can even read the articles themselves right from the app. And when it comes to blind spots, it's not just about discovering different stories. It's also about discovering just how political bias frames the stories themselves. So even if both sides have reported on a story, their framing could be completely different. I have Ground on my phone's home screen, and I cannot recommend them enough. Because of this, we've decided to offer a special 30% discount for Ground News' Vantage subscription. You can only access this discount by clicking on the link below. So check it out and help support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.